Welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. George, we've got a service transition this week that both of us kind of know from different kind of settings. And you know him from a mastermind, and I know him from, he actually presented down in Austin earlier this year and actually had a pretty big impact on me. So Peter has some good content to share. So why don't you go ahead and introduce him for the show?
Well, Peter bought actually 2 fee-for-service practices in the Northeast. He's in a more rural area, and in this interview, he talks about his experience buying the first one, and then eventually he buys into one new location. And so he talks about that, and we know each other from Graham Dursley's mastermind group. He's done very well for himself, and he's grown the practices he's purchased quite a bit, and he almost has like the unicorn practice now, fee-for-service practice, where he does a lot of the systems-based things that are in maybe a more high-volume, low-fee practice, but he has the high-volume, high-fee. And so I think that's an interesting perspective. And he's in a rural area, like I mentioned, so maybe that's...
Where is it? Is it, you said...
I think it's in New Hampshire. My memory is losing me at the moment, but I believe he's in New Hampshire in a more rural spot.
Okay, right. Awesome. Well, the thing that he describes is kind of his journey through fee-for-service, how he got into it there, and his recommendations. So I thought this was a great interview to kind of get a different perspective rather than someone who's in a very crowded metro area, someone who's in a rural area, and what they would do if they were going back. So we'll take the interview away. Dr. Peter Bowman.
I have with me here today Peter Bowman, and Peter has purchased not 1 but 2 fee-for-service practices, and so I wanted to have him on the podcast to talk a little bit about his experience for looking to buy fee-for-service practices. So I'll let Peter introduce himself, and then we'll just start talking about his experiences and some of the things that he has to share. So Peter, how's it going?
Going pretty well, George. And yourself?
Doing pretty good. I'm excited about today's episode. Fee-for-service that a lot of people are looking at, but not a whole lot of people are talking about. So I'm happy that we have you here on the podcast to talk about your experience.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that.
And Peter, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about yourself, and
Sure.
then we can start talking.
Okay. Well, my name's Peter Bowman. I've been a dentist for about 9.5 years. I graduated from West Virginia University in 2008. I'm originally from California, but my desire my whole life was to live in New Hampshire. So that's basically what I did. And I spent about 14 months as an associate until a doctor in a town that I wanted to live and practice in approached me about wanting to sell his practice. So at the time, I think that was 2009, he was $150,000, fully fee-for-service. Basically, long story short, we struck a deal on that one. And I think I did that for about 5 years and nearly doubled the size of the practice by the time another practice came up for sale. Very similar, small practice, only 3 operatories and doing somewhere in the $500,000 range production.
Okay, so you purchased the first practice, and how many operatories was that first practice?
Only 3. 1 dentist, 1 hygienist, 1 assistant, and 1 front desk. And the third op was really just kind of small and non-functional. So we hardly ever used it until a few years into it when we hired a second hygienist.
So you had 2 hygienists?
2 hygienists and me. And I was a 1-chair dentist for about 5 years until we moved out of that place.
So, Peter, I got a question for you. What kind of job did you have before you bought?
I was an associate in a practice that had 3 dentists and 7 chairs and 4 hygienists. So it was also like starting off my first 5 or 6 years at a dentist. I only knew single chair. So later on, when we moved into a larger site, it became a little bit different to get used to.
So was your practice model significantly different from the fee-for-service practice that you purchased versus the associateship that you had?
When I was an associate, I was pretty oblivious to that, like the differences between fee-for-service and PPO and all that stuff. My first year, I was just like, okay, I'm going to be a dentist, I'm going to do some dentistry, and I'm going to get a paycheck. But, I started to question whether I was getting paid for everything. And apparently to the office manager had to do with dealing with all sorts of different insurance and PPOs and all this stuff, which is why I seemed to be making less than I thought I would. It was a little disorganized, so it seemed to me. So moving into this field, it was much smaller. It's a lot easier for me to wrap my head around my naive brain at the time.
Uh-huh. So,
yeah, it wasn't really high volume at the other place either, but I think if anything, it was overstaffed for the amount of I had and the number of chairs I had too. So it was good that I got away.
And Peter, the practice that you purchased, was it something that you had always been wanting to do, buy a fee-for-service practice, or is it just like the practice happened to be fee-for-service and that was the one you were going to buy to live?
Well, after working for a year as an associate there, I started to really see the difference between fee-for-service, and especially with talking to the guy who was selling. Mm-hmm. It just seemed to make so much more sense in a market where that could be done, and it really so it wasn't until talking with him that I was really actively looking for fee-for-service practices. So fortunately, where I am, because it's rural and some might even argue it behind the times, fee-for-service seems to exist in a lot more abundance than maybe Austin, Texas, or other urban areas.
All right, I'm really happy you touched on that. That was my next question for you. So I always, whenever buyers are looking at fee-for-service practices and they ask me about them, I always tell them that they need to understand why the practice is able to survive as a fee-for-service practice. It makes it, able to do that. And so in your case, are you saying that the location?
I think it has nearly everything to do with location, yes.
So can you expand on that? What about the location specifically do you think allowed the practice to be fee-for-service?
Well, only 3,000 people. And there's a few other towns. It's just all about the same size, and they've got one or two dentists in them. So, for instance, in my case now, we've got about 3,000 people in town. There's myself and my associate. And then if you go about 10 minutes away, there's another similarly town with 4 dentists there. So I guess if you do the demographics, you're still seeing only one doctor for every 1,500 or 2,000 patients. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of old doctors who've been doing it for a long time. And then things from when everything was fee-for-service in the 70s and 80s and maybe before that. Versus the pressures of a growing area where startups are more common, there seems to be a lot more pressure to have to sign up with PPOs just to have.
Gotcha.
So for me, it's always made a lot more sense to, especially in hindsight, seeing that I think I did think correctly, is to look for practices that have an active patient base and cash flow. Doesn't necessarily practice, because you'll pay virtually the same for an existing smaller fee-for-service practice as you would just to start up a whole new, practice and pay for new equipment and all this stuff. Yet you don't have a single patient coming in.
Exactly. And Peter, I wanted to ask you, so in your case, I think you're lucky in that where you're located in terms of the fee-for-service. I think you just mentioned that. What advice? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, part of it's luck because I in this area and in this town in specific too. But, if I were to do things all over again and I didn't have my heart set on going to a certain place, knowing what I know, I would certainly be looking for some of these types of similar places.
So for somebody else who may be in a bigger market, let's just use Austin since you used that example. Mm-hmm. How would you go about it to find a fee-for-service practice, and how would you make sure, now that you practice in that fee-for-service model, what would you do to make sure that the patients stick around with you as the new owner?
Well, if I was living in a place like Austin, you were saying?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd be able to get it to work too well, but I suppose, I'm not a great one to advise on this, but I'd be looking for the guys who are in their 60s who currently have a fee-for-service practice. I'd want to know what they're netting. I'd want to know how many chairs they have, how many days a week they're working, and see if that suits the lifestyle and practice style that I'd want to do. My guess is it probably wouldn't be in an area that's really actively growing. It's probably going to be in an older area, more established, where the patients are still used to seeing the same dentist for a few decades. And as long as you've got a good transition with the seller and they can hear about you, you should be able to still keep it at fee-for-service.
All right, is that what happened to you then? The seller wrote that glowing letter and then they pretty much just rode away in the sunset and you took over?
Yeah, pretty much. And that's the way it was for both acquisitions. walk-away sale, as it was called.
Uh-huh.
However, when I was talking with them, being only a first-year grad, essentially, I wasn't sure I was too confident and comfortable with walking in and being the lone dentist, having only that. But the seller refused. He basically just wanted out. And so I basically had to take a risk and give myself a little bit more confidence, because an opportunity like that, particularly in the city where I wanted to live, was not likely to happen again for a while.
That's a great point. You know, those small towns, obviously there's not many practices, so when one of them goes for sale, you know, you kind of got to jump on it.
That's exactly right.
And so, Peter, what other things did you kind of do in the transition to help those patients maybe stay on, or, you know, is there anything else that you would recommend somebody buy a practice, but especially a fee-for-service practice?
Well, hopefully they've got good quality staff. You know, and sometimes when you've got the same doctor and the same staff who've been there for 20 or 30 years, there's a lot of catching up with the times that some of them have to do. The way I saw it, well, first thing, I looked at the hourly wages the staff was being paid, and I was blown away by how high it is. So that kind of made me feel a little bit uneasy. But on the other hand, it was just cash flow, and making right off the bat at least gave me the confidence that I could afford to pay them still. So it was my intention to keep everybody for at least the first year, because, you know, I'm not going to be the first person that just sees when they walk through the door. They're going to see the same receptionist who they've been seeing for potentially a couple of decades. So that first impression that not a whole lot has changed except for the doctor at hand brings a lot of patients, I think, and boost their willingness to keep coming to that specific place. And then you follow that up with the same assistant or the same hygienist to come to seat them. You know, everything's the same except for the guy doing the examination.
Gotcha. You know, how long were they intact? Are they still intact? You know, how did that work?
Yeah, I haven't had to let anybody go yet. So
wow,
the original
really?
3, yeah. So the only time anybody's left their practice is when they move to a place like Maine or something like that. So, you know, people still work for me, and, you know, they still make the same as they did, maybe a little bit more. I do know that they went around, you know, when they heard that their former boss was retiring, they started looking around for other jobs and trying to see what maybe with this new guy, where could I work and how much would I get paid? And I think they started to see there's no way they're going to get paid what they currently did. So they rode with me. They were very helpful in helping me to understand how the practice go. And, you know, they've been a very valuable asset. So I think I've been fortunate that I've had some good staff to keep me through this. Now, I'll admit, I wouldn't quite say they're like all-stars per se, but they've been really good in just keeping things going. So perhaps I'm lenient or patient enough to, you know, as I start to outgrow them with whatever knowledge or dental, and able to train them to keep up with the times.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think the staff can be such a huge asset for a new doctor coming into the practice, because, you know, they know how it works every day. And so, you know, there's a lot of things that you can ask them. And huge, I think, in the whole scheme of things when you're looking at a practice.
Yeah, if you're looking to do fee-for-service, what I think really what's important is the new doc is to maintain some familiarity for a while. If you look at the practice on day one, September 2nd, 2009, and you go back to this past Thursday, there's just nothing is similar except for a few bodies that are working in the practice. It changed quite a bit, but, you know, these patients have also had 9 years to adapt and evolve with it. And we've been overwhelmingly positive for the better as far as their experiences have been.
And so what kind of changes are you talking about there?
Okay, well, you know, the first thing, I don't know if the patients would agree with this is positive, but the seller who didn't have insurance wouldn't charge a limited exam for their hygiene, for the hygiene appointments, which I kind of felt suspicious. Well, maybe that's insurance fraud. But we did it for a year, and then I finally found out, in fact, it was. So that was that some of them objected to. That we had to send a letter out and saying, look, I know it's been done this way, but apparently it's not allowed by the state of New Hampshire. So we had to do that. We had to charge a limited exam for everybody who was uninsured. And but for the most part, I think we still kept about 90% of those cash-paying patients. So that's the main negative change as far as they would perceive it. But as far as the changes for the better, we were working for Thursday, and then I decided to expand it to Fridays. Forgive me if I'm rambling here, not really going anywhere in specific.
Oh, no, you're fine.
And you can edit this stuff. But so we did that. We had Fridays offered for a little while, but then we found out we got kind of burned out working 5 days. So we went. But, the patients were starting to see we introduced some new technology into practice. For instance, we went from film x-rays to digital, which their minds were blown away. The fact that they could see their tooth on a screen to the right of them. And then that simple things, I started with a very old-fashioned practice, and it's probably the best way to have done it. Intraoral cameras and other types of technologies that are really pretty typical for the average dentist nowadays. But town set of patients, and they're used to seeing things definitely done the old-fashioned way. I guess it's easy to grow and make these changes for the positive for them.
That makes sense. I see what you mean now when you're talking about the changes. I wasn't sure exactly what you're about.
First, a word from our sponsor, Q Optics. Okay, I got to take something back that I said in the last ad. I said that your neck hurts because you're looking over the top of your loops more than your angle of declination. Really, it's all of it together. And the angle of declination really does matter. And in fact, I said if I want as much as possible, they said, okay, let's go with 50. You don't want to go with 60, that's too much. Let's do 50. And it's been awesome. It's been great. But now I want to look at how do you diagnose if your loops aren't working for you? And for me, the biggest sign is if my neck and my upper mid back, kind of between my scapula and my spine, hurts. And you get these tight knots. They're called trigger points. And if you're right-handed and the right side of your back from the base of your skull down to your scapula to your upper shoulder hurts and is tight and has knots, it probably means you're bending over too much. You're craning too much. Something else that can help with your ergonomics, not only is magnification and loops in general going to help, but your working distance can push you back and up. It can retrain you. So getting a new pair of loops can also be an opportunity to learn how to sit better. If you push it out a few inches, your working distance, at first it's going to be a little unnatural. You're going to be kind of leaning in like you normally did, and then you realize, oh, I'm too close. But over time, you train and you adjust, and your muscles learn how to sit up straight. So this is an ideal time to correct some of your bad habits and take your ergonomics to the next level. For $100 off a pair of loops or $300 off loops and light combo, email sales@QOptics with the promo code SP16. Q Optics, your next favorite pair of loops.
Now in our timeline, so at this point now you've been owning growing that practice, and then did you built a new facility, and did you move into that facility before acquiring the second one, or did you do that? How did that work?
It was kind of in tandem. I had already been planning to look to relocate because we were outgrowing these three operatories pretty quickly. I think we had maybe 1,200 patients at that time, maybe, which, when you only have 3 chairs, that's actually kind of a loaded practice. So where we were working more hours, and we did not want to go back to Fridays again. And it was also when the other dentist a couple blocks away has retired. And there's a whole different story on how that transition worked, but I'll just keep it simple, that I'm the one that ended up with the practice. It was even more outdated. The operatories also, the overhead lamps were kind of a yellowish color, so B1 and A4 pretty much look the same when you're trying to do a composite. So he had all the equipment, which really wasn't worth much. I paid him, I think it was $250,000 for whatever patients he had left. And just like before, keeping the staff at the first practice, I kept these other 2 initially for the same reasons, because I wanted those patients to have familiarity and see the same faces when they're seated in the dental chair. And they've really been some great additions, and they're still with me. But what we did is we took those patients and still moved them into my already tiny 3-operatory practice. So at that point, we had time hygienist and me, and we were working from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Mondays and Tuesdays while we waited for our larger facility to be built. And I think we did that for about 8 months, so from January to August, where we had something like maybe 1,600 patients to work out of 3 chairs.
Wow.
And then suddenly, September, I think it was, we moved into our other facility, which had 8 operatories. So you can imagine that's a huge change for anybody who's working single chair dentistry. And then suddenly you've got 5 extra chairs to work with.
So how are you using those chairs now? How has it been in the new facility?
Well, we've been doing it for one thing. So we always have let me go back to 3 years ago when we first started. We had 2 full-time hygienists. So suddenly you had 4 rooms available for them. And even then, we still kind of went single chair hygiene for maybe a few months before I put my foot down and said, look, so that we have assisted hygiene possible with dovetailed appointments with an assistant starting and finishing each appointment while the hygienist is always doing 30 to 40 minutes of pro-free or perio maintenance time with a patient. And breakaway seminars back in 2013, I believe it was.
And did you also use the breakaway, concepts for your build out?
No, I looked at it, but basically we already had a good connection. And I already had been working with another architect to design the practice before I ever went with breakaway. So I stuck with the people I already started working with.
Okay, so your floor plan and everything doesn't resemble a breakaway office?
It does, actually. And when we were planning to move to the facility, being, I guess you can say, small-minded in a sense, going from 3 operatories to 5 seemed like, oh, wow, that's like a 66% increase in practice size. I don't think I'm going to need more than 5 operatories. And the architect said, well, you're going to need at least 6, so let's at least design it for that. So we did. Fortunately for me, I had some pretty good free will or free range on how much of this rental space I wanted. So originally we were going to do about 2,500 square feet and with 6 operatories. But then I went to breakaway and started to see how the scheduling could work, and with smaller operatories using, design ergonomic types of concepts and stuff like that. As soon as I got back, I talked to my architect, who fought hard tooth and nail to get me to do 6 ops. And I told him we need to do 8. So he was a little blown away by that, but we made some slight changes in the floor plan, and we were able to in about 2,800 square feet.
And Peter, I got a question for you. So when you're looking at your practice and you bought a 3-op practice, I know you didn't have like an array of offices to look at where you could really be picky because you wanted to live in that area. But a lot of things I tell people is to not buy a practice less than 4 operatories, or, because ideally, buying a practice and then shortly thereafter having to move to a new facility, that can put a lot of stress on, your initial. So what is your advice, having done it that way? What is your advice on buying that smaller practice? If you had the choice, would you have bought a larger facility that already had the number of operatories you needed?
Depends on how you want to look at it. Because I feel like I bought a valuable stock at a very, especially where I was in my career. I wasn't really super efficient with my clinical skills yet. I still needed like 50 minutes, maybe to an hour to do an MOD composite on somebody. So for me, it worked for the pace that I was ready. So I think to answer that question, it kind of depends on where you are on your clinical efficiency skills at the time. If I could do it all over again, I probably would, but knowing what I know, I would have done it at a much faster pace and look for a spot that had at least. But if I were to acquire and have satellite offices with associates running it, I would still be looking for the same types of demographics, like small town, rural practices. I'd want to see what their fee schedules were like in the 50th percentile or the 90th percentile and things like that. Because, like I said earlier, if you're going to pay a good couple $100,000 for a practice, I'd rather buy the one with the cash flow and the fewest write-offs. And, you go to certain rural, There's a lot of them. New Hampshire has some. That's just from personal experience. I know there are elsewhere in the country. If you want to take a pretty easy lifestyle and make some good money while you're at it, so you're not working for 70 cents on a dollar all my life.
Our mission at Shared Practices is to navigate the path to successful practice ownership. As this is something that we are constantly trying to improve, we ask for feedback from people who have already become practice owners. Feedback that we've been getting is that our podcast does not allow listeners to get enough information in an organized way where they can actually apply it to their situation as they're looking to buy a practice. I think this is the biggest area where our podcast falls short. We try our best to infuse the podcast with information, but ultimately the medium at which it is consumed does not always allow us to get exactly what we want for it. This is why we've created the Ownership Accelerator. We saw a need for an in-depth and comprehensive course to cover both practice acquisitions and journey into practice ownership. It is our way of fixing all the things that we wish we could accomplish with our podcast, but are not able to. That being said, we have finally released the Ownership Accelerator. The Ownership Accelerator is an online course that takes you step by step through the entire process of buying a dental practice. The idea behind the course was based on our experiences helping people find practices, analyze deals, and ultimately their experiences closing. We saw the things that made some buyers successful and other ones not as successful. We saw challenges they face and ways to stack their cards in their favor to find a great practice. We teamed up with Paul Goodman, who has tons of experience working with both buyers and sellers. We also enlisted the help of professionals David Alvey, Brian Pender, and Rob Montgomery. The result was a comprehensive online course about buying a dental practice that consists of 12 sections, more than 80 10 to 12 minute videos, and the entire course comes out to be about 15 hours long. Included in the course is a 250-page course manual that gets shipped to you to help you go through the course. Also included, we have spreadsheets, worksheets, and checklists to keep you on track as you go through the process of buying a dental practice. The ultimate goal of the course is to help you find the right practice to buy, not just any practice, but the right practice for you. We strongly believe that the right practice will maximize your income and career satisfaction. Ask yourself what your career would look like if you bought a practice that maximized your income and career satisfaction. Visit ownership.sharedpractices.com for more information. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Start your career off on the right foot and take the Ownership Accelerator today. I love that. And Peter, I forgot to ask you before, so when you're looking at a practice and you assess the fee schedule, so in both situations, did you change after, because fee for service is very fee sensitive. Patients are very well aware of what things cost. So like versus I'll be buying an insurance PPO practice and pretty much you can go change the fee schedule and nobody will know.
Right.
But in your case, it's kind of, how did you approach the fee schedule?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. I didn't change the fee schedule for the first 6 months to a year. Then I looked back into it, and he hadn't changed his fees for about 3 years. And I had always been taught, since I took a seminar, right, raise your fees about 3% a year. But a lot of people get something called pricing timidity because they're afraid of patients rejecting seeing the big fee change. So I guess there's an easy way around it, and you're really going to everybody has to raise their fees periodically so they can keep up with inflation. But what I did was I basically kept the diagnostic and preventive stuff the same. So the prophy fee didn't go up for a year, exam fee, x-rays. So people would walk out knowing, oh, okay, I paid the same as I always did. But you can raise, your fees for any restorative work or crowns or whatever to a much higher degree. So, you can raise those 4 to 5%, but not touch anything that involves the high.
I'm happy you talked about that because with price sensitivity, with your recare, it's always like Breakaway talks about this, where your recare fees need to be lower, and then your restorative fees, they're less sensitive because patients don't really know those numbers since they're not as regular. And that's ultimately where you'll be making the majority of your money anyway. So,
right.
Happy we talked about that. And so now, how do you go about scheduling and working in that larger practice? It's a big adjustment. So how has that been? And what has been your experience?
The experience has been great if you're the type that doesn't mind maybe a little bit more hectic atmosphere. But my wife, who's been an exceptional designer in the practice as far as the colors. It's very welcoming, very soothing. It's generally feng shui designed in a sense. So I don't know where I'm going with this question really, but basically the first impressions with the patients has always been a good one. But, because of where we're located, and I want to make sure that for anybody who's going to relocate, really give strong importance to the location, because the old practice was just kind of tucked away in the middle of town on a town common where there's not a lot of traffic. And then we moved to basically the busiest road along the shopping center. And we get new patients coming in like crazy. It would be maybe 13 new patients on average at the old place. And that never really changed for the 5 years that I was there. And then suddenly it jumped up to about 50 because we were on a busy. So I'd ask new patients, how did you hear about us? Well, I saw you were building this new practice. You're a new guy in town, and so I thought I'd check you out. A lot of them didn't know I'd been here for 5 years already. So that was how we got a lot of the growth, was from having frontage and visibility. We eventually hired a hygiene assistant, and so that was the big thing that we needed to do in order to use those extra operatories for the hygienist and show them give them the confidence of knowing where they're going to be and when. And, the biggest concern was compromising quality of care. They didn't want to feel like a robot working in an assembly line. But after just kind of reviewing through everything, they're still going to get an hour's worth of time, although not necessarily a 100% of it coming from the hygienist herself. They were able to roll with it and start to see how things would be better. And so now they all like it better because they don't have cleaning up and setting up and checking blood pressures and taking x-rays and stuff. They get to do what they were trained to do and hopefully what they enjoy doing the most.
I love that.
So that was, yeah. And then, like I said, I was a single dental assistant. And so it was even hard for the one who still worked with me for now 30 years for her to accept having another assistant helping us, getting the other rooms ready and set up and patients seated and so forth, so that she could follow me for chairside dentistry.
So are you 2 chairs now?
Yeah, I'm working at a 2 to 3. Depends on whether my associate is there or not. There were even times where I was working at a 4 because at least having that many rooms available, we could see emergencies on the same day. We could at least guarantee them an exam and an x-ray to figure out what had to be done. So it went from, single chair, drill fill, do an exam check, sit down while you wait for the room to be turned over, and then see another patient. You're always somewhere at all times, having to be mindful of who's going to need a hygiene check next. So do these exams while somebody's getting numb or doing an impression or what have you. So it was a bit of an adjustment doing all that, multitasking.
And, it sounds to me like, well, I know this because, this is not my first time meeting you. We're both in Graham's group, but you kind of have one of those unicorn practices that everyone talks about. Is that correct? The higher volume fee-for-service practice? Yeah.
That's kind of how I would describe it. It's not something, it's almost like the dream practice. You're going to have high volume, you're going to be working at a lower fee. But it just kind of grew that way, what seems like by accident, but if I really look at it, it was all piece by piece, a little step, and keep it fee for service and still have high volume.
And one thing that I love about what you did is you took concepts from a more efficient, typically lower fee model. I'm generalizing, like the assisted hygiene, for example, and you applied them to the model, which is just tremendously more profitable, even though you're, because you have higher fees. And so I like that you're trying to integrate, or you are integrating those concepts to your practice and not feeling like that's a different model, so I'm not going to put it in my practice. So I really like that you. And that was very smart of you.
Yeah, it's kind of a way to see the best of both worlds, and I still feel like I do practice dentistry without having to really rush things or maybe compromise the quality, of what the patients are getting. But good staff to do a lot of the stuff that you can delegate that otherwise I would normally have been doing myself, which kind of waste time or profitability because I've been trained to do dentistry. So if I'm not performing dentistry or at least leading my staff, then I'm not using my full potential.
And then, Peter, you kind of touched on it before, but I wanted to kind of hear a full explanation for you. Now, you've purchased 2 fee-for-service practices. So if somebody was going to look at a fee-for-service practice, what kind to look at?
Okay. Well, first, I would say maybe not go looking for popular places like Austin, Texas, even though places like that might exist. You've got to be willing to live in a rural area because just about anybody I know who is fee-for-service is in those types of demographics. I would want to know what the average age of patients are. Millennials are not particularly my dream patient base yet. As far as, if you're going to be a dentist, you're going to be fixing dental, find as much there. So, for instance, where I am, the average age of the population is 46 years old. And I think the national average is 36. So that 10-year difference means you're really serving a lot more people who are in age. They've got some dental breakdown. They've actually got some money to pay for this stuff. So that's one thing I would look at. I'd want to know what the competition is like elsewhere. Are there many other dentists that are fee-for-service? For instance, I think I'm still the only one who's fee-for-service, and most everybody else is PPO'd around me. So I kind of look at it as I don't really want to join the crowd, or the herd, I should say. So there is something to be said for being the only one doing something.
And so would you be more encouraged by a lack of fee-for-service dentists, or would you want a majority of the dentists there to be fee-for-service?
I would probably prefer that everybody was fee-for-service, but I wouldn't let it deter me if there was only one person who was. I think it would be a lot more difficult and maybe even impossible to have a fee-for-service practice as a startup unless you're in a place where most people just don't seem to have dental insurance.
Okay. So, but you'll be acquiring those patients, so I guess that's it is less of a concern.
Mm-hmm.
And then, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I kind of lost my train of thought there.
So I want you to talk about maybe some of the challenges that you faced buying a fee-for-service practices. What kind of things did you experience that maybe were challenges because of the practice that you purchased?
I'll be honest, I didn't feel like there were a whole lot of challenges. I think it was all pretty straight. I guess the biggest challenge maybe was patients accepting having a new doctor. They want to know that they're going to be treated well. And I guess they got to like you is one thing. We had an intraoral camera, so if I did a beautiful poster picture and show them, they want to know that they're getting good work done. But I'll tell you what, the easiest way to do it is to find the old doctor still doing the amalgams everywhere, and they're doing anterior PFM crowns because it's just so much easier to please these patients. And there are practices out there that are like that. So, I'm kind of looking for maybe the most old-fashioned practices to purchase if I were to keep doing that, because it's the easiest way to make big gains.
Very accurate. And I'm happy you talked about that. And Peter, do you have anything else for our audience who may be looking to buy a fee-for-service practice? Advice that you want to give them based on your experience that we haven't talked about so far?
But everything that I can think of at the moment. To sum it up briefly, look for the older practices, the ones who have been doing it that way all the time. And hopefully some of these sellers have already known about raising their fees periodically here and there. There's so many out there that already exist this way. And I think it's a lot easier to buy an existing one and use their cash flow, even though you're using old equipment and stuff like that. It'll make for a better lifestyle for you than trying to start and draw in people at the fee-for-service. So I think it might be kind of a dying breed in dentistry, but there will always be some. And you've just got to be willing to look for potentially the unpopular places to live. Although I live and I've never wanted to live anywhere else, that's how it's going to work for you.
I like that. I think if there's one thing to take away from your episode, it's probably the importance of location when looking to acquire a fee-for-service practice. And so I think we definitely covered that, and I appreciate you coming. I really enjoyed it, and I think the audience got a lot from it, so I really appreciate you coming on.
I hope they did. Thank you very much for your time, George.
No problem.
Okay, now we're back. George, what was your big, what stood out to you from that interview?
things, and we'll talk about we'll talk about in the outro. But the thing that I really thought was funny was he talked about. I asked him, like, could you do this in a metro area, or if you weren't rural, do you still think you could be fee for service? And he was like, "No, I don't think so." And it was
Which is
funny.
ironic considering that
Exactly.
Drew has done exactly that in kind of, despite all of the insurance competition and other competition. So it can be done against all odds.
But I think it makes the point that it's overwhelmingly more difficult in a situation like Drew, where people are more naturally easy.
Sure.
And he talked about, it was funny because he talked about, like, I asked him, what kind of things would you look for? What were you looking for? And he kind of mentioned a lot of things that we talk about on the podcast in a very, like, not technical way. Like looking for older practices who referred out a lot, kind of you want to see looking at a practice for sale. But in a way that was not, clearly he didn't listen to the podcast, but, it was also the same idea. So he clearly knew what to look for, but he didn't really have that from a formal. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, and, it's kind of like the dream that everyone has, like, oh yeah, like you just walk into this older practice and it's fee for service and it stays that way. And then you just grow it. Yeah. It's not always that easy. And it does not always turn out as well as it has for him. And I thought he was kind of very frank about that. Like, this is not the typical situation. And I'm very fortunate to be in this situation and that everything has worked out, but that's not always the case.
Oh yeah. And I think there's two things, next week we're going to learn about why that's not always the case. We're going to talk about maybe a not so great experience. And the two things I want you to kind of carry on to that third part are both Peter and Drew had their staff stay on with them throughout the whole, Peter still has pretty much everybody from both offices, which I think is pretty remarkable. And then also Peter, what he did in practice, merged it all into under one roof and moved locations. And I want to contrast that versus having two separate locations, like we'll talk about in the next episode. Yeah. I think it's a very good point to make. And I think Peter's experience, the fact that he merged them in one roof, is one part of the reasons why.
Yeah, he had the ability to do that. And the staff issue, it's so hard because that's one of the gambles, is that, this whole fee-for-service transition is always a gamble. You don't know how it's going to turn out. Your staff stay on, like, you can't know that. You can't know if in 6 months someone's going to just leave or retire out of the blue. And so there's a combination of doing your research, but then at some point it's like, okay, this is either going to work or it's not, or it is going to, and we're accounting for that. We know that. And you move forward.
Yep. And I think it's, you want to know as much as you can going forward, but you're not always going to know everything. And I think next week's is really going to be awesome in showing that point.
Okay, cool. Well, then, week on the Shared Practices podcast.